Dr. Nardi here, and in this video, we're going to talk about the research proposal. And this is the last major step of your research process. So make sure that you pay exceptional attention to this part of the phase, because you've already gone through the IRB and you've got everything approved. You conducted your study. And now it's actually time to write it up. So we'll talk about what the research proposal includes, and it's similar to what's in a manuscript. The major elements or components of your research paper are your abstract, and this is a short summary, an introduction, so you introduce somebody to the topic. Then you give them a literature, so you give them a background of the past research and the most seminal studies that have been done. You also want to do a method section, which includes participants, materials you use. So if you use surveys, you list out the surveys, you explain in detail, how you gathered the data. So you want to be very specific here so someone could replicate your study. You also want to include your results or your findings they could be either statistical in nature, so you could be doing some kind of experimental design or using statistics, or they could be qualitative in nature. Either one, that goes into your results section. Then you have your discussion, and this is where you talk about your results, and you kind of integrate the past literature that you've cited earlier in the paper, and you also make recommendations for future studies and talk about the limitations of your study. And finally, you have your reference section. Now, a couple words of caution, and I always put this out there for anybody, whether you're in my class or watching a video online, is you want to be careful of plagiarism. And this is using someone else's work, so taking someone's text, drawings, designs, or ideas without giving them credit. And basically, it's a type of fraud, so you don't want to do it, and it involves deception for your own personal gain. So do not do it. It's a very big issue in academia, and it could get you kicked out of a class or even a school. So do not plagiarize. And if you take someone else's idea, just make sure you give them credit using a proper citation. And we'll talk about how you do that in this video. Now, the other thing I want to mention is make sure you manage your time well. A lot of students, a lot of people, working adults will mismanage their time, and they won't stay focused on their deadlines, and then they end up feeling overwhelmed, and then that could potentially lead to plagiarism. Not always. So kind of create a timeline for yourself and create milestones and deadlines for yourself. That way you stay on track and you meet those deadlines and have some personal accountability. And one other thing I want to say is make sure that you cite, right? Or any kind of paraphrasing you do or direct quotation, even though we try to reduce the direct quotation. And we often, if you're doing a direct quote, that is, you use the author date, a page number, and quotation marks. And you want to differentiate a direct quote from just a paraphrase. So we'll talk more about that, but keep that in mind as you write. Now with direct quoting, especially in the psychology, the social sciences field, you want to avoid direct quoting. And if you do direct quote, do it sparingly. Your paper should not be full of direct quotes, but paraphrasing or rephrasing something is a good idea, but you don't want to copy it too closely because then you run the risk of plagiarism. So you want to make sure that when you rephrase it, you do it in your own words to the best of your ability. So it's all about putting things in your own words without deviating too far from the original text. You want to rearrange words or replace some words to avoid plagiarism. And if you fail to give adequate credit to an idea, then that is, again, essentially plagiarism. So do not do that. Make sure you always cite as you write. Cite as you write. Now, a couple things to keep in mind as you write your paper. Now, normally I write the title of my paper last, but generally speaking, there's some rough guidelines. So there's no minimum length or maximum length for your title. They used to say it should be no more than 12 words. Now the APA manual doesn't indicate that, so don't worry about that. But you want to be succinct, so you want to keep your title as focused as you can. And you want to include the necessary keywords so somebody could find your research if they're looking for it online, which is always good to do. Now, you also want to think about when you're writing your title to make it alluring, right? You want to make sure that your reader thinks you're interesting, or if it's not an interesting title, they might think you're a dull thinker and they might not read your paper. So you want to make sure that it's interesting. And you want to gather that interest so somebody wants to read your paper. Now, once you have your title page done, right, then you have to do your abstract. Actually, you write your abstract last, but in order, it goes title page, then abstract, but write this last. It'll save you a headache. And basically, the abstract is just a condensed version of the important elements of your paper. And the abstract is usually about 150 to 250 words, and then you usually can include some 3 to 5 keywords, right? And that's depending on the requirement of the journal or of your class that you are taking. And the abstract, when you write it, needs to contain the topic you're studying, the characteristics of your participants, the methodological approach and major dependent variables, and the results, the conclusion, implications, or applications, depending on how you look at it. So the abstract can be formatted as follows. The abstract starts with the word abstract, center and bold on the top of the page, and the text of the abstract starts flush for both forms, whether it's structured or paragraph form. And in a structured abstract, there are separate sections labeled objective, background, method, results, and conclusions. And the keywords is italicized, followed by a colon, and they're placed beneath the end of the abstract text, and they're indented 5 spaces from the left margin. The keyword or phrases themselves are not italicized, and no period is placed after the last keyword. So make sure you go through and you read that APA manual to get a real succinct idea of what the abstract contains. Now, once you have your title page, then you have your abstract, then the page that comes up next is the introduction. And in this introduction, it basically sets the stage for your reader, and it basically starts off really broad, and then it narrows it down right to the core of the paper. And you want that first sentence to be captivating and get somebody's attention. And what you do when you write that introduction is the goal here is to introduce literature, to integrate literature, right, to help your reader to understand not only what's been done before, but also give context to the present study, right? So you want to integrate papers, and you could do it different ways. You could take a historical perspective. You could focus on theoretical framework and how that's developed. You could take a methodological perspective and talk about what methodologies have been used in the past and how's yours different. Or you can contrast different literatures with data that's been obtained. Now, in the literature, the introduction and / literature review, you want to make sure that you follow how to cite and quote in the literature review. So, for example, most citations should be put in parentheses. And if you have more than 40 words or longer, you put it in block quotation format. So again, just review the APA 7th edition manual for specific changes. So when you think about writing that introduction, most sections of your research paper are written in past tense. So when you write the introduction, right, you usually write in past tense, how you collected your data, past tense, right? If you're going to use present tense, it's mostly used in the discussion section and implications, right? And the measures used in the research. You could write those in present tense. Now, the length of the introduction section, that varies depending on the journal and depending on your class. So if you're writing it for a class paper, your professor will tell you what they want for the introduction / literature review. For just looking at journals, most journals will suggest 8 or 9 pages of an introduction. But again, don't take my word for it. Check with your professor or the journal you are writing for. The next section you have is you have your introduction / literature review. Then you have your method section. And this is basically where you focus on the presentation of the facts. So you talk about the participants. How many participants were in your study? What was the demographics of your participants? Where did you draw them from? How did you draw them? The materials section talks, or materials / measures section talks about how your instruments what the instruments you used, how many questions were on each instrument, were there any like reliability statistics you could report or internal consistency statistics you can report, like Cronbach's alpha, you report that here. And you're basically being detailed about the instruments you used. So it's participants, instruments, and then you also want to talk about sampling procedures, so how the data was collected. You want to be very, very specific in this section. That way, if a researcher wants to run your study, they could do it on their own after reading your paper. Building on upon our last slide here, you want to get the total number of individuals who participate in the research, also called the sample. You want to give the demographic details, like their ages, their sex, their ethnicities, whatever data you collect, you want to present that here. And how many, did they come from, undergraduates? Were they college students? Like, tell the reader where you got your sample from. And the measure section, as I just mentioned, focuses on the instruments used. You want the name and the characteristics of each instrument or scale that was used. And you want to give reliability and validity information about the scale. So you should put that here. And if you use any audio or digital equipment, you should also mention that here. Now, the procedure section is how the data was collected. And you basically can divide it up, and you want to talk about your sampling procedures. So you want detailed information on the approach used, where you got your participants, the ethical standards you followed, so refer back to the IRB that you followed, and you want to talk about the incentives. If there were any incentives, you should talk about it here. And then you also want to talk about the data collection. So you want to talk about the time frame, so how long it took to collect the data, the place of where you collected the data. If it was online, mention that. And you also want to say what are the instructions that you provided the participants. And you want to mention, was this studied, was it a survey design? Was it collected in a group? Was it individually? So be very specific here so someone can replicate your research. So after your methods section, you have your results section. And when you think about writing a results section, you want to think about how it flows, and you want to use inferential statistics here, and you want to be very clear about how your data procedures or your data analytic strategy was carried out. And when I say data analytic strategy, I just mean the procedures used to analyze the data. And how, if you had missing data, how was that addressed, right? So you want to be very clear about that. And you want to start with your major hypothesis first before moving into any secondary hypothesis you have. You also want to talk about any additional relationships that were discovered during the course of the study, so you can make it clear if there were a post hoc analysis. And you want to be very clear and transparent in the reporting of any findings in the study. It's very important. And you want to mention any steps you use to maybe clean up the data. And also any information or adjustments made to the data should be presented at the onset of the results section. So you want to be very transparent with your readers to tell them exactly how you analyze that data. The last section is your discussion section. And this is where you interpret your results. So you want to make sure that you interpret the results of your study, and you want to relate it back to any early research that has been conducted before. And you could say our study was consistent with past research or it was not. You also want to talk about the significance of the study, right? So why is this study significant? How does it add to the literature? You want to point that out for the reader. So generally speaking, if you start with your discussion section, it starts more narrowly and then widens and integrates the relationships of finding to existing literature. And you also, in this discussion section, want to talk about the generalizability of your findings. So can they be generalized, and if so, how? And you also want to make sure that you refer back to data that supports any claim that you made. And the last part is you want to extend your study and talk about any future studies that could happen. And you also want to talk about the limitations of your study, right? So you might want to make this a separate section. And here you talk about threats to internal and external validity. And you want to focus on any shortcomings of your study, and that way future researchers can change it and make it better. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care. Bye-bye.